Okay, so in part two about this week's topic, we're looking at thinking about progress. And progress here in the sense that, like, as in the first section, all these absurd waste things are going on. Like, we like to think about the way that that our societies are developing as they're kind of moving forward and getting better, and like this relates to notions of modernity, that like science and technology are making things better, capitalism's making us more comfortable, technology's working for us, and all that kind of thing. Much of this relates to how economics, as a kind of form of knowledge, dominates the way that we think about the world. Now, you might think like a sociologist and anthropologist are jealous.
I'd
love
to be.
Probably are. And maybe if sociology and anthropology dominated, there'd be problems as well.
Yeah,
so
it's true.
It's not necessarily just disciplinary jealousy here. It's more that, like, the narrow form of economics that's used in our political discourse, the policy decisions, what's, very generally and sometimes problematically called neoliberalism, the way that it kind of ignores many of the problems and just kind of focuses on, money on the page and, cost-benefit analysis that externalizes a lot of things, is seen from a sociological perspective as being really problematic. Certainly from an environmental sustainability perspective as well. So economics dominates the world. They kind of have very specific things, definitions of what value means, what efficiency means, and how profitability is at the kind of heart of everything that we do. Ironically, this is often related back to Adam Smith as being kind of the founding father of these kind of laissez-faire economics. But the way that Smith's work is promoted today is very much a distortion. So while there's very similar, laissez-faire kind of free trade, neoclassical stuff draws on aspects of his work, they kind of ignore the kind of human philosophical ethics literature part of what Smith did. It's kind of like, people that talk about the Bible and then, don't care about inequality. You can pick and choose stuff out of texts, and the way that Smith's used to kind of buttress economic knowledge today is a distortion. So, more specifically, one of the key distortions, I think, is the model, the figure of the human that's that the dominant paradigm of economics uses, and this is the idea of Homoeconomicus. So this idea of Homoeconomicus is kind of the heart of the way that humans are imagined within economics, is this kind of rationalization machine that's kind of constantly making choices for maximum utility, to kind of, make more money, get better experiences and all this kind of stuff. It's a fairly selfish, competitive model of the human, and as, sociology and anthropology shows, is very much a distortion of what humans do. Like, as Miller shows, there's much sacrifice. We do all kinds of emotional things that don't make a lot of sense in terms of making money.
So many irrational things.
Yeah, so the model in this sense is like, Pierre Bourdieu referred to it as an anthropological monster. It's a kind of, that has very little correlation to the way people live and actually make decisions. People won Nobel Prizes for this kind of model, and it's still kind of dominant. So, an irony thing, and again, this is probably, again, a disciplinary thing, like, you can win Nobel Prizes in economics in contemporary society today for things that sociologists and anthropologists were talking about a century ago. Economics now discovers that the family apparently is an important thing when it comes to thinking about these things and all this kind of stuff. So, again, economics portrays a distorted understanding of humans' relations, and even like human needs and desires. Humans aren't necessarily maximising effortful people. That's not necessarily what we want to do.
It'd be incredible. I think we're often quite jealous that imagine being able to talk about humans in such a standardised way. Well, our job is recognising all of the complexity of humans and human behaviour and the spaces they create and inhabit. We're constantly drowning in complexity. Being able to think of humans in a singular or with a set of singularities would be incredible.
Yeah. And so behavioural economics has come along and tried to kind of, I think, take on aspects of the kind of way that we look at the world through, and it's kind of seen as all these innovative things that we've been banging on around for centuries. So the other thing that kind of economics is increasingly criticised for is the kind of financialisation, if not kind of mathematics-based kind of understanding of the way societies work as well, but we don't really have time to go into that too much. So one of the things that's a real problem with the way that the cost-benefit analysis or budgets and even kind of working out what things cost, is the idea of externalities. An externality is a cost or benefit arising from any activity which does not accrue to the person or organisation carrying on that activity. So there's positive and negative externalities. Positive externality may see the public's enjoyment of views from a private building or fertilisation of fruit by trees, this kind of stuff. So the construction of a 100-storey building may have all these detrimental environmental effects, but it may create a positive externality that creates a really nice view. What we're interested in here, certainly when it relates to waste that I was talking about in the first part, is the negative externalities. The damages to other people, to the environments, to other people's ways of life, through things like radiation, pollution, noise. These things that happen in the production, consumption, exchange that no one really pays for. And when no one really pays for this stuff, it means the things that we're paying for are actually cheaper than their true cost. So there's been a rise of true cost economics, for instance, that's trying to, and eco-economics and green economics is trying to kind of bring in these concerns into more mainstream fields. So when I kind of bag economics as a discipline earlier on, within the field itself there's all kinds of struggles going on to what should be the dominant knowledge, still very, very, very much dominated by more right-leaning, laissez-faire attitudes, but there's stuff going on there. So this, to me, should lead us to question what progress means in the way that we think about this stuff. So, I mean, we largely measure progress on whether GDP is going up. Again, I'll go into that. Well, that's absurd. But so we need to then, I think, question if economics is going to be the dominant form of knowledge that we kind of use to organise society with and make decisions about. We need to now hold it to account and hopefully get it to include the things that at the moment are building up to the point where, again, large-scale environmental problems are kind of threatening the very existence of the way that we live in the very near future. So, there's a kind of question of discourse going on, and anyone looking at done sociology before would have understand that expert discourses are things that provide us with ways of lives, norms, knowledges, and stuff like that. The debates that go on within economics, and then how they affect and influence politics and ways of life, are really important. They're not theoretical.
Yes.
Because
they're applied almost right away.
Yeah, that's right. Because the way these kind of forms of knowledge then come out to decision makings in the wider world are profoundly influential on the way that we live, on who eats and doesn't, who dies and doesn't, who gets a job and doesn't. So the idea of progress here being attached to something like the GDP is kind of silly in many ways. I mean, I've got a graph here further on that the GDP, if measured in that sense, has been going up since 1950s. Therefore, everything must be good. There's been the development of the GPI that I'll talk about in a minute, but the GDP basically all it does is examine economic exchanges. More economic exchanges, the better. So theoretically, lots of car crashes could be good for GDP, as long as people aren't killed. Even if people are injured, there's insurance pays off. There's someone fixes this. There's things that seem like to be problems can actually be good for GDP. So then why are we thinking about that kind of stuff like that? So GDP measures exchange, but it isn't measuring progress. Yet we use GDP as some kind of indication or symbol of progress, or even happiness or satisfaction, whether things are good or bad. You'll see a lot of stuff. GDP is going down. Look out! Everything's going to go to shit. And but really, it doesn't really measure our satisfaction or happiness.
And the problem is the measure also then takes on an agential quality that if GDP is going down, you see disinvestment and money pulling out, which costs people jobs, and then they can't spend, and then and it's very difficult for governments who are presiding over GDP stagnating or going down to maintain their legitimacy.
Yes.
Even when their control over those things is often very limited. They're often blamed or seen as getting in the way of GDP functioning better.
That's right. So, if governments were to make a decision that would actually be the benefit of the general population that's bad for GDP, they'd be seen as irresponsible.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so there's information on there, but I'm going to unpack that on these. So, like, for instance, something like importation, exportation, lots of these things going in and out are good for GDP, but they're obviously really bad for pollution and our economic footprints. These are quite dated figures, but I can't imagine it's changed too much. And they're America that, like, I think it's in 2002, they imported 209, thousand or million tonnes or whatever of coffee, but exported exactly the same amount. Same with green beans, same with potatoes, same with beef and veal, same with refined sugar. They were exporting and importing almost identical amounts of this stuff, creating all kinds of activity and exchanges, but like, why? Just for the sake of kind of more production, more whatever. You could argue if that wasn't happening, there'd be less jobs and all that kind of thing, but really what's being measured here is exchange, not necessarily like anything, good or ethical or that. Same with this idea of the way that fishing works. 2 million tonnes of fish taken from the oceans to produce 871,000 farm salmon. Like the kind of different methods of doing things have real effects on waste. So, for instance, in terms of true cost economics, there's been the development of the genuine progress indicator, and it has a much more modest idea of whether the economy's been working for us, in the 50 years between 1950 and 2000, for instance. Why? Because it actually includes things that GPI doesn't. It includes things like, ill health and life expectancy, sick leave, like all these other kind of things that actually are central to whether people are having good lives or bad lives, or having good times or bad times, or happy or sad, into this. Now, it kind of almost feels absurd to kind of consider emotions in an economic calculation. But if we aren't actually including these things, what was it for? So again, I would go back here to the model of a human, that somehow the model of a rational human therefore somehow correlates to some kind of rational model of society. It doesn't. It does the opposite. These rational understandings of how people live actually create all these irrationalities that lead to unhappiness, anxiety, that I'll get into in the third part of the lecture. Another thing that, again, this is a relatively older idea now, but it's actually come to much more mainstream prominence. So the idea of the ecological footprint, and again, this is just some kind of mechanisms here to think about the scale of the way things work. So ecological footprint is the amount of land that an individual's consumption would need for it to be produced. If we take into the world's livable landmass and the population, at the time of the figures that these were done, it was 1.9 hectares per person. At the moment, across the globe, we're using 2.3. So there's not enough earth for us to continue to consume in the way that we're consuming. From that measure, we need 1.5 earths. Of course, when you look at that further, at the time the US needed 9.5 hectares, Australia needed 7.7. Somewhere like Bangladesh was lower, it was 0.5. So you can see a kind of measure of global inequality moving in here in terms of people's overconsumption is more so the problem here than people kind of living closer to the averages. China is 1.36, so even a place we could kind of think as a developing thing is still under. The couple of billion people there, where there is, if they kind of move up to more Western standards, it's going to be very much problematic for these coming sustainability problems. So, again, this is an example of a different kind of economics, actually measuring things that relate to the limits of growth and the limits of the environmental kind of degradation, the limits of what we can take from and extract from the earth and kind of turn it into things. Okay, I'll leave that there, and in the next section we'll talk about the value of nothing.